How did the Japanese plan to seize the decisive terrain in the Guadalcanal campaign? We look at the Battle of Henderson Field.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War. This episode looks at how the Japanese are planning to regain the initiative after the defeat of the Third Battle of the Matanakau. Last week we saw how poor intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance and poor command and control saw the Japanese bested whilst they were on the defence. That's fairly unusual for the Japanese. But to some extent they were surprised, so they didn't have their defensive positions well prepared. Once again, this week we are joined by Dave Holland, a battlefield historian who's lived on Guadalcanal and the author of Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, The Battles of the Matanakau. Let's get right into the episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm glad to be back on this nice, sunny Australian day. So, yeah, we'll get into the Battle of Henderson Field, which is one of the most important, or the apex of the Guadalcanal campaign. So I'm very excited to talk about that today.
We've talked about some of the terrain when we looked at Edson's Ridge, which is to the south of the airfield. Do you want to just talk us around some of the other terrain, like particularly the terrain leading up to it, the terrain that's going to become so important as the Japanese make their advance to Henderson Field?
Yeah, so I discussed, I think, in the first episode about the terrain of Guadalcanal, especially around the coast. So what we're going to see here, the Japanese are going to try to do an envelopment. And their envelopment attack will go through miles of thick jungle, very steep ravines or jungled ravines, rivers, streams, just sheer vertical cliffs, and basically cutting a path through the thick jungle. So yeah, it's probably the hardest terrain you can probably think about in your head, or especially moving a whole division, making a quote road, and we'll discuss that. So it's very brutal terrain they're going to try to move through.
And a division is quite a large number of troops. How many troops would have been in the Japanese division moving up?
Well, so the Japanese had different classifications of divisions, and the classifications A and B, not so much that doesn't reflect the quality, which generally a lot of times it did, but it reflected I think an A division had a artillery, organic artillery, and a few other more support units than the B unit. And plus the A units were considered some of your frontline units. So all the units they sent, all the two divisions they sent to Guadalcanal were both A units. So the second division we're talking about here, the second Sendai Division, is a famous division in the Japanese Army, or it was, I guess still is, you could say. So they were an A-class division. So roughly, that's off the top of my head, I would say about 15,000. But what we'll see here on the march, because they had to shed a lot of weight to move through that thick jungle, they're trimmed down to about 6,000. But as you know, and it all depends on the different, say, World War I or World War II, when we're talking about 9,000 men in a division, or as you know, the infantry units, or what every infantryman is about 9,000 in, say, a 15 or 16,000 man division. And of those 9,000, they're the trigger pullers, and the rest of them are support. So on this march here, the Japanese will see, we're all, I guess, quote, the trigger pullers, the riflemen and the machine gunners and the mortarmen and some artillery and some engineers. So yeah, and hardly any support. I think they have some medical and signal staff, but that's about it.
It's an awfully large number of troops to be getting through some awfully dense jungle for an extended period of time.
And they're all in one big snake column, a ranger file, as we used to say. And the road they're going to go on, I guess we'll talk about that later, was roughly 3 to 5 foot wide and had overhead cover because they're trying to move through the jungle without being seen. So they sent their engineers beforehand, just basically cut a path. And they call it, quote, a road, but it was just a jungle track. And that was through the nice level parts of the jungle. Then when they reached the cliffs and the ravines, we're talking about ropes and in ladders and hands, and there all kind of stuff to get the guns and the people and their supplies up and down.
So what was the Japanese plan to advance to the airfield, and what was their intent to assault the airfield?
In the Third Battle of the Matanakau, and that's why I said it was very, very important, because if you remember, the initial Japanese plan was to seize the east bank of the Matanakau River. There they would establish a firing support base for their heavy guns to suppress the airfield. And then also that would provide a launching pad or push-off pad for their tanks and their infantry to basically attack straight down the coast with one group going on the east-west trail, which is the lower slopes of Mount Austin. They're going to do roughly an envelopment. But once the Marines denied the Japanese the east bank of Matanakau, the Japanese had to come up with another plan. So Hayakatake, the lieutenant general, the 17th Army commander, got his group together, and they started working out some plans. Now, in the meantime, and this kind of differs, depends on which Japanese sources you see. There's still a bit of controversy about how they did the reconnaissance to work out the potentially an envelopment down south. So the Japanese, the chief of staff, I forgot his name, I've got it written down somewhere, chief of staff of the Japanese 17th Army and the chief of staff of the Japanese 2nd Division, apparently went on top of Mount Austin and had a Japanese lookout post there. And then they could see the Marines' perimeter. So if you ever go on top of Mount Austin on that eastern view, you can see the perimeter. You can see the Henderson Field, quite spectacular. Anyway, they looked at it and they said they seen the Lunga River. And they thought, well, we don't see any troops there. We don't see any defenses. What if we could flank Mount Austin, go to the south of Mount Austin, go through the jungle, come up the Lunga River, using the jungle as cover, and then strike the Americans basically around the Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge area, where we think is undefended, or potentially a bit to the right, because the Americans think we're going to attack across the Matanakau and we're going to attack to their western flank. So that's what we'll do. We'll just send our engineers forward. They'll cut a road, take us 4 to 5 days, and we'll be there and strike straight out of the jungle. Because the Japanese had a tendency of striking, using the terrain to their advantage in speed, shock, and surprise. And they said, we'll do this now. So they went back, spoke to Hayakatake, so he called a command group. So he had Lieutenant General Maruyama, which is division commander of the 2nd Division. You had our friend, I wouldn't call him friend, but the infamous Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji, we discussed earlier. You had Major General Kawaguchi, the man from the 2nd Matanakau and the Edson's Ridge battle. So they got them all together, and he said, what do you think? So Tsuji and Suji and Maruyama says, look, we should use one force to do a fight across the mouth of Matanakau, and then we should cross upstream at the One Law Bridge or a bit further up to Matanakau, then come down the northern slopes of Mount Austin and strike what they designate as the Kuma Ridges. Now, the Kuma means bear in Japanese. So the Kuma Ridges are directly across from the airfields. So Fighter 1 in Henderson Field, there's a series of ridges there, probably about 600 yards, 700 yards. If you could put a force on those ridges with any direct fire weapons, you could dominate both airfields and basically render them ineffective. So that was what they were wanting to do. And then Hayakatake had the final say, and I think his staff officers and maybe someone else kind of put a word in his ear, says, look, we can hit them. This is almost a slam dunk. We can go to the south. They won't see us coming. And once again, they underestimated the terrain, didn't know the terrain that well. They only visualized the terrain. No one's actually walked it. They just seen it from a couple of miles away. And they said, this is what we'll do. So they maintained the diversionary force plan. So we're going to use the diversionary force, including the tanks, going to have an infantry regiment with the diversionary force, with the company of tanks, to push across the Matanakau to draw the Americans in. And then at the same time, they were going to take another depleted regiment of Colonel Oka, who crossed downstream and come up on Hill 67. Because remember, the Marines left 2 battalions on the Matanakau line to hold it. So when one force, they're going to do like a reverse American plan. So they were going to hold the mouth of Matanakau. Another regiment was going to cross downstream, come up, and trap those 2 battalions. In the meantime, the rest of the division is making their way down south. It's supposed to be, 5 miles. It was 15 miles walking, but 15-mile track, then struck the south and come and overran Edson's Ridge. And once they overran Edson Ridge, one force was going to shoot across the Lunga and take the Kuma Ridges, and then you'd have the airfield. All this was going to be simultaneous assaults. And at the same time, learning the lessons of the Battle of Edson's Ridge, they didn't have a follow-on force. The Japanese had planned a follow-on force. So that a whole battalion with actually airfield repair personnel on ships. So as soon as the airfield was taken, this battalion was going to land. Then the airfield personnel was going to repair what they needed to and get the airfield up and running because they had planes in Rabaul ready to fly in. You got to remember, Admiral Yamamoto had the combined fleet, which is the largest fleet since Midway, ready to go. So what they were going to do, they were going to draw the American fleet out and fight a decisive battle all at the same time. So all this was going to occur simultaneous. So as soon as the Japanese had took the airfield, they were going to launch a code word called Banzai. Then that would trigger the different elements of the naval force to start moving in. They had one element, like I said, the covering force. One element was going to be a naval bombardment force, and the other element was going to be the main combined fleet was going to take on the American fleet. So they were going to go basically to the southeast of the island and cut off the American fleet when they move in. So that was the grand plan.
So it's interesting because from a land domain point of view, this is the main effort is taking the airfield, and that is then going to trigger the decisive battle for the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yes, and actually the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese High Command was envisioning this to be the grand decisive battle, land battle and sea battle. This was going to be the decisive battle. So at the end of September and early October, that's when I started seeing the actual words in the Japanese correspondence, the regional correspondence, when they're actually saying decisive battle in Guadalcanal. They're putting both of those words. They call it GA. That's GA is the name for Guadalcanal, the code word. So GA, or probably butchering that, but GA and decisive battle was in the same sentences or the same document. So they've started the Japanese High Command said, this is the decisive battle of the war right now, so far. That's what they envisioned it is. So they threw everything they had down that way to do it. This was going to be the epic battle. Because remember, too, when they hamstrung the Japanese artillery firing platform, then that's why they had to get those fast transports in during the day. And that's why we come up with the idea of the naval bombardment by the big battleships. That was Yamamoto's idea. He goes, well, we'll just smash them. And then we'll have a series of 2 or 3 days of airstrikes. So you had potentially 3 days of naval bombardments planned. The first day was going to be just 2 battleships going to smash the airfields, and then follow the next day by air raids. Then if anything's left, then they had a cruiser force and destroyer force going to come in the next 2 nights and just finish it up. So that was the grand plan. And at that stage, the whole Cactus Air Force would have been suppressed, and they could have offloaded the big transports with the big guns and tanks and thousands of troops.
So we're actually seeing what would be generally an unusually high level of cooperation between the IJA and the IJN then, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I think they had to basically suck the pride in and say, well, we have to cooperate. But once again, when we say cooperate, it wasn't fully cooperating. The Army was always complaining about the Navy's not bringing enough supplies in, and the Navy are basically saying the Army are being too slow. But they are trying to work together, because now they had the Emperor's full attention. So he was watching this battle with his full attention. So, issuing orders and decrees and things like that. So
to protect the Japanese convoys, the IJN they had one big night of significant naval gunfire support. On the morning of the 14th of October at 01:33, the 2 battleships Kongo and Haruna went offshore of Henderson unopposed, and they fired 973 14-inch rounds on the area of Henderson Field. What was the effect for the defenders at Henderson?
You got to take it one step back. What's the time limit they fired them in? That's another. You can't say 975 rounds without saying the amount of time they landed in, because that just shows you the saturation. 18 minutes.
That's a high rate of fire, isn't it? Which is what one of naval gunfire is known for.
12 minutes, or roughly. I have to look at my Alabama math, but 12 rounds a minute. We're talking 14-inch, which is 300 and what? Do a conversion real quick. 300-something millimeters.
Yeah, 350, just a little bit more than 350 mil.
So Richard Frank, the historian, he declared it's one of the most saturated intensive bombardments in history. Definitely of any American force has probably never been hit with a saturation of bombardments in that short a time with that amount. I've racked my brain. I've spoke to other historians. We can't come up with another time in 80 minutes, about 975, 350 millimeter rounds, all hit a small area and subject to that. No, we can't think of any other force that was subject to that intensive bombardment, especially Americans. It's just something for you to do, James. Maybe you can go out. Maybe some listeners or viewers can come up, but I've put that out there a number of times. And People said this, but we're not talking days or months. We're talking 18 minutes. Saturated bombing. So yeah, it really, if any veteran of Guadalcanal, you always find in their diaries or the stories, they always talk about this night. They call it the night of the battleships or the bombardment. Any veteran to go, yeah, I was there during the bombardment. They've been there for 6 months. They know exactly what the other ones are talking about. Now, the 164th U.S. Army Infantry Regiment, the first U.S. Army reinforcements, ground reinforcements to come in. So they landed on the 13th of October. So they landed in the morning, offload the ships, Japanese air raids hit them. Okay. Then that afternoon, it's the first time the pistol Petes, the 150 millimeters, started suppressing at maximum range, like we talked about last week. The 164th, they go, okay, the 2 air raids are finished for the day. Next minute, what's that? Oh, that's not an air raid. And some of the World War I vets, the Marines went, oh, that's not an air raid, that's artillery. That's the first time the airfield was hit by artillery, registering rounds, 150 millimeters. And then, after the few registering rounds, the 164th says, oh, geez, so first day in combat, let's just rest. Right after midnight, this big starlight burst popped up. And what is that? Next minute, these trains come flying through the air as they described it. And that's just the 350 millimeters or 14th rounds hitting all around them. So that was one of the most interesting welcome to combat of any unit, I think, I can think of, those guys. I think many of them said, well, I'm tired of Guadalcanal. I'm going to get off this place after that. So, yeah, so it smashed it. It smashed the airfields quite well. And we'll see in a minute. I think the next question you might want to ask me about what was the damage.
Yeah, so what was the actual effect? How many aircraft were destroyed? Because that was the intent of it, was to deny the ability to conduct air operations from the airfield.
Yeah, so it wiped out quite a number of like Wildcats and Dauntlesses. There was a little handful enough to get up the next day, but it really hurt them bad. In fact, it burned all their avgas up, or aviation gas, most of it. So Major General Geiger, who was the Air Wing commander, the Marine Air Wing commander, he did a smart thing. And they basically spread all their fuel and their ammunition around small dumps. So no eggs in one basket, so to speak, if you get blasted. So they had a few of that lasted, but a lot of the av gas was gone. But they had enough the next day to put up a few planes, because the Marines were pretty demotivated. They looked out and they could see 10 miles down the coast. They could see these Japanese transports unloading in daylight. So the Marines actually got up a few planes, not many, but enough to harass the Japanese and fire them up quite a bit. Enough that the Japanese said, well, we didn't suppress them, but we're going to do another night of bombardment, another 2 nights of bombardments. So yeah, they did pretty good to get a few planes up at it is. But once again, if they would hit them again another night, they would probably destroy the whole airfield. Now they hit Henderson quite well. Now about 400 or 500 yards to the south is Fighter 1. So Fighter 1 was able to be functional, but just like I said, most of the Wildcats were gone. There was a few Dauntlesses left, and I think they made a plane out of a PBY. They called it the Frankenstein plane. So they threw some parts together real quick and strapped a torpedo on it, and that even went up. So they were just getting together anything that could fly and sending it to the Japanese transports. But the Japanese basically unloaded most of the transports and unloaded most of the supplies. The Marines did fight back a bit and give them some damage, but not that enough for them to offload most of their stuff.
So in between the previous Battle of the Botanical and the lead up to the Battle of Henderson Field, the Japanese had received 15,000 troops, the remainder of the 2nd or the Sendai Division and the 1st Regiment of the 38th Division. For those that had already been on Guadalcanal, what sort of condition were they in? How highly motivated and how well supplied were they?
Well, that one wasn't that well supplied. You got to remember, we're looking at the 124th or the 35th Brigade under Kawaguchi. The ones have been fighting pretty hard. The 124th, some of what's left of the Ichiki guys, some of the naval garrison troops. So, they were doing it quite tough. They were sick. Malaria started kicking in. They were suffering from hunger, beriberi, some of the dengue fever. So they were in pretty bad shape. Even the 4th Regiment, because that was the whole thing with the Japanese, they couldn't offload all the troops in one big go, because as you know, in Guadalcanal you can offload one unit. They're there for 2 weeks and their whole unit cohesion, their effectiveness is starting to go down. So that was a thing that Hayakitake was a bit frustrated with. if he could land all 3 regiments at once, it'd be nice and fresh. But he'd already landed the 4th regiment, so they were a bit sick. And plus, they'd been fighting the Marines for a good month, so they're pretty much depleted. And that was the unit he was going to use to do the fete. But his 2 strongest units, the 29th Regiment and the 16th Regiment, they came in. They were part of the 2nd Division, so they're fairly fresh. Because he knew they had to use the fresh troops, the strongest troops, to push through the jungle. They knew it was going to be a hard trek. They thought, well, we Japanese infantry, we're used to moving through impassable terrain that they didn't expect us to come through. So, yeah, they wasn't in that great a shape. They were enough to hold the line and stay on the defensive and do limited attacks, which we'll see.
Now, if we look at the intelligence preparation of the battlefield to feed into the planning for Hayakataki's attack, what did they know about the defenders? What was the picture and how accurate was it?
Well, once again, both sides underestimated or overestimated the enemy. The intelligence wasn't that great for both sides due to a number of factors. The Japanese knew their least space in the Marine Division. They knew that. And they had estimated between 10 or 11,000 Marines were there. On the top of my head, something like 30 or maybe 30 pieces of artillery. And I think initially it was 30 planes or 40 planes, but they destroyed all the planes except for a handful. But yeah, about 10,000 Marines dug in. And they knew there was 1 Marine battalion estimated at the mouth of Tanaka. In fact, there were 2 Marine battalions. They estimated most of the Marine defenses were on the western side and none on the southern side, and small defenses on the Alligator Creek on the eastern side, but nothing in the thick jungle to the south. Because you got to remember, they can't see through the jungle, but they can see the ridge lines, and they can see American defenses on the ridge lines. So that's one of their estimations, because they couldn't see in the jungle. They didn't think the Marines were there. Plus, they said, well, the Marines didn't expect us to come through that thick jungle, so therefore they wouldn't have any defenses. They actually called them, if you read their contemporary primary accounts, they called them supply bases and things like that. They think they could see supply dumps on Edson's Ridge, which there were. There were some supply dumps, but they just seen it built up as logistical, not defenses. This was the initial planning, and we'll see later that changed. Their intelligence changed. But yeah, they underestimated what they're going. Once again, underestimated what they're going against. That stage, Marines, and now with the influx of the 164th Regiment, we're talking potentially 21,000. Well, on Guadalcanal, it's probably about 19,000 in, because you still had some on Tulagi, probably another 2.5 on Tulagi.
Yeah, well, I think they talk about 23,000 on Guadalcanal and another 4,000 on Tulagi, out of an estimate of 10,000. So they'd only accounted for about 40% of the troops that were on Guadalcanal.
And also, you got to remember the state of the Marines too. I mean, their health wasn't that great either. They're suffering from malaria. They're suffering from you hear some accounts that they were starving, which is not true. They're not starving. They're hungry. I had one Marine officer says, we were never starving. We were hungry. And the Japanese, they were starving. That was later in the campaign. But yeah, no one was starving. They were hungry, but they were sick. And then you got to remember, too, they've never had a let-up, never had a rest. You can't rest on Guadalcanal. There's no rest areas. In fact, some of the front-line infantry guys used to go out of the, quote, rear area to go back to the front so they could sleep. Because you imagine every day you're getting bombarded in the perimeter. You're getting hit by naval gunfire. You're getting hit by air raids. The perimeter, quote, the rear area wasn't a safe place to be. There was no place to rest on Guadalcanal. They didn't even have a PX. Or, they couldn't even buy stuff. In fact, there was a story. The division paymaster who was in the rear echelon was left in New Zealand. So he flew in September. And he goes, the men probably want some cash. So he flew in September on one of the cargo planes. He had a big black suitcase full of cash. So the deal was he was going to go up, and if he would give $100 to each Marine, just like an advance payment. And they basically laughed at him. They said, well, what are you doing here? And where are we going to spend money? And they all laughed at him. Apparently got back in the plane the next day and never seen him again. But they were suffering. The Marines were suffering too. The whole play. And plus, you got to remember, they're kept awake all the time. So, as you know, in the military, you've got to stand watch. You got working parties during the day. You're you're getting bombarded during it because you had the Japanese float planes, Wash Machine Charlies, were dropping bombs, dropping flares at night, keep the Marines awake. So they're probably averaging 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And then they've got the same clothes they've had since day one. They're sick. They got dysentery. It's just miserable place to be, miserable existence.
skin infections, the rain.
Oh, yeah.
Because when it rains there, it doesn't rain, it pours.
Yeah, everything's clothes falling off of them, rotten. They got tropical ulcers, sores, nothing ever heals. It's just a miserable place. But once again, they can't get out of it. There's no rest area. They can't go back, take a shower. They can't get new clothes. Can't get fresh. Can't just lay their head and get a night's sleep. They can't. No way.
Do you want to just talk us through the maps that they were using? Because the terrain and the way that the Japanese were planning on using the terrain is a really important part of the story of the Battle of Henderson Field. What maps were they using and how accurate were they?
You're talking about the Japanese?
Yes, yeah.
The Japanese had a British Admiralty map. I've got a copy of it. And it looks... the coastline is very accurate, which you can expect, because it's Admiralty map they use for shipping. But the interior of the map, it only goes a bit past south of Mount Austin. I think it was just an artist says, I've got the rest of the map. I want to make it look pretty. I don't know what it looks like. I'll just draw a few bits and pieces to it. It's like those old Mariners map when they drew like the sea monsters and stuff all on the side to make or artistic, make it look pretty. And that's what it is. But that's what they were using. And they had some aerial photographs. But once again, you're just showing thick jungle. And as you know, you're operating in jungle terrain. We were in Panama once, and you're looking at the aerial photos and say, well, that looks flat as everything until you get on the ground. Then all those fake little hills, or not fake hills, real hills that you see that you can't see under the canopy in those days. It's the same thing. You fly over and there's nothing there, but there was real thick, steep hills. But they couldn't see any of that. So they're just going by, they're eyeballing it. So they're looking off Mount Austin and say, well, we can pass through that. If we hit the Lunga River, then we could go up the bank of the Lunga River. That looks quite passable. You got to get to the Lunga River first. As the crow flies, we're talking from where they started Maruyama Trail, the road, you're talking 11, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 miles. But then they had to transverse about 15 miles.
We'll leave the episode there and come back next week to continue our look at the Battle of Henderson Field. Once again, a big thank you to Dave for his scholarly wisdom in this pivotal battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. Before we go, though, I just want to think a little bit about the bombardment. As someone who is fascinated by indirect fire in all of its manifestations, I think it's important that we stop and reflect on just what happened during that night. The bombardment occurs on the night of the 13th, 14th of October. The night of the 11th to the 12th of October, so just 2 days prior, sees the Battle of Cape Esperance. The Imperial Japanese Navy sends down a resupply convoy and a bombardment group to attack Henderson Field. Rear Admiral Norman Scott intercepts the bombardment group. He sinks one cruiser, one destroyer, and he heavily damages another cruiser, and this forces the bombardment group to withdraw. However, Scott's force doesn't spot the resupply convoy, and they are able to unload successfully. On the morning of the 13th, the 164th Regiment of the Sendai Division lands on Guadalcanal, and aren't they about to get a welcome to the jungle? Japanese aircraft raided Henderson Field twice on the 13th. The first raid destroyed 13 aircraft on the ground and critically ignited 5,000 gallons of gasoline. This was at a time when gasoline supplies were very limited. During the afternoon, American reconnaissance planes spotted a Japanese resupply convoy 200 kilometres away from Guadalcanal. This was a high-speed convoy. This was a new tactic brought on by the loss of the ground to the east of the Matanikau. The Japanese realised they were now no longer going to be able to suppress the airfield. They would have to push through without denying flight operations at Henderson Field. This convoy is not using destroyers to provide logistic support. It consists of 6 fast transport vessels, and each one of these has got 6 to 8 landing craft and strong anti-aircraft batteries. So this means that they're going to be able to unload much quicker than the destroyers would have been able to. The convoy is carrying 4,500 troops, which is the equivalent of 6 infantry battalions. They've also got 1 battery of 10cm guns, 1 battery of 15cm guns, and a battalion of anti-aircraft guns. There's the first independent tank company and stocks of ammunition and provisions. This is an important convoy bringing significant reinforcements for the Japanese on Guadalcanal. At 18:30, a 15-centimetre gun commenced firing on Henderson Field. This gun was located west of the Matanikau, 2.5 miles southwest of Cochabamba. This was well out of counter-battery fire range for the US artillery. This forced the Cactus Air Force to divert operations to Fighter 1. This was a secondary airfield that had been constructed and opened by the Seabees 1 month earlier. The high-speed convoy isn't the only convoy that is heading for Guadalcanal on the night of the 13th. As Dave mentioned, Rear Admiral Kurita has got the battleships Kongo and Haruna. They have got 8 14-inch guns each. There are 9 destroyers as escorts and a light cruiser. Originally, the Japanese had planned on sending the Yamato, the super battleship, equipped with its 18.1-inch guns, but when they considered the manoeuvring room in Iron Bottom Sound and the logistics of getting the Yamato there, it was decided to use Kurita's 2 fast battleships. These battleships are capable of 30.5 knots. A lot of planning has gone into this naval gunfire support mission. A gunnery officer from Yamato was situated in an observation post on Mount Austin. He would be perfectly placed to be able to observe the fall of shot and issue corrections to the ships. Not only that, Kongo's gunnery officer was in one of the 4 spotter and illumination planes, so he would be able to provide a commentary from above. When you think about it, situating yourself above enemy terrain would be quite difficult. However, once the rounds start falling, once the fires start burning, getting that appreciation of where you were and being able to adjust the fall of shot would be a lot easier because you would have excellent command of the ground from your airborne observation post. Let's have a quick look at the 14-inch guns on the Kongo and Haruna. So 14-inch guns, these are a 1910 design supplied to the Japanese by Vickers Armstrong. The Type 3 shell, which is one of the types of shells that were used in the Bombardment, has got a small explosive charge designed to scatter 470 individual incendiary submunitions. This is an excellent choice of munition if you are looking to interdict petrol, oil and lubricant facilities, as well as targeting relatively soft-skinned aircraft. The round was 140 centimetres long and weighed 622 kilograms. The high explosive round had a range of 28,025 metres at 43 degrees elevation. That is quite a range to be hurling 625 kilos of projectile. As you can imagine, you require a significant amount of propellant to send something that heavy that far, and as a consequence of that, the barrel life was between 250 to 280 rounds. So after firing 250 rounds, there has been so much erosion within the barrel that the gun will need to be replaced. The guns themselves can fire 2 rounds per minute. And Kurita planned to have both of the battleships firing into a target that was just 2,200 square metres in area. The impact area would overlay Henderson Field and Fighter 1. At 0130, an irregular chug that sounded like a popcorn machine was heard at Henderson Field. That was the engine of one of the observation aircraft. Soon after that, the ships slid past the south side of Savo Island. They slowed to 18 knots and set a course of 77 degrees. 3 lights had been set up along the Japanese-held coastline. These lights were used as reference points from a known point that the gunnery officers were used to be able to triangulate and determine the position of the ship. At 0133.5, Kongo opens fire at a range of 29,500 metres. She is followed a minute and a half by Haruna. The Japanese ships were operating outside of the range of the 5-inch batteries at Lunga Point. They were, however, able to answer them with their secondary armaments. The light cruiser Isuzu engaged the marine artillery located on Tulagi. As we said earlier, that was 973 rounds Only 104 rounds were of the incendiary nature. There was 189 rounds of high explosive. The majority of the bombardment was used with armour piercing. Now, this round is excellent against other battleships, other cruisers, and would potentially go straight through a destroyer. But when you're attacking a land position, armour piercing is not the munition of choice. They also fired 55 rounds of a modified 12-inch round. So that's a sub-caliber round that's been boosted to be able to fit into a 14-inch gun. During the bombardment, one round threw General Vandergrift to the floor of his dugout. He described as without hurt except indignity. He then wrote, "A man comes close to himself at such times, and until someone has experienced naval or artillery shelling or aerial bombardment, he cannot easily grasp a sensation compounded of frustration, helplessness, fear, and in the case of close hits, shock." Martin Clemens wrote that the ground shook with the most awful convulsions, while dust and smoke nearly solidified the very air. We need to look briefly at an important response that the US Navy had to the bombardment. On the 12th of October, 4 motor torpedo or PT boats had arrived at Tulagi. Their presence was unknown to the Japanese, and Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery, the commander of Motor Torpedo Squadron 3, had decided to withhold them from action until there was a suitable target. Initially, the Japanese force had been put at 3 destroyers, and he didn't think that that was worthwhile. But once he could see what was happening to Henderson Field, and have a look at a map, they're based at Tulagi in the port there, they would have been in a prime position to see exactly what was happening. The commander of these 4 patrol boats decided to attack. Just to put this into context, the PT boat displace about 46 tonnes and they're 23.5 metres long. That's about a tenth of the size of the 222 metres of the Kongo. She weighs in at 37,187 tonnes. The Kongo is 808 times heavier than one of the PT boats. And there's 2 of the battleships. There's a cruiser and some destroyers out there as well, but that's not going to worry him. If you're looking for another way to look at how this David and Goliath battle is shaping up, each PT boat weighs as much as 70 of the shells that the battleships were firing. That means that the weight of the shells that the battleships fired was 3 times as much as the entire displacement of the 4 PT boats. They got in amongst it, they loosed off some of their torpedoes. It doesn't look like any of the torpedoes hit, although with American torpedoes of this time, it's always difficult to tell. The boats then laid a smokescreen and zigzagged out of contact. Admiral Kurita could see what was going on. He wasn't fully aware of what was happening. At that point, though, having fired all of the incendiary and HE rounds, Admiral Kurita decided that they would cease the bombardment and commence their withdrawal up Iron Bottom Sound. And so at 02:56, the Japanese guns fall silent and they commence their withdrawal at 29 knots. The action of the plucky PT boats had brought forward the end of the bombardment. At 05:30, one of the Japanese howitzers commenced firing on Henderson Field. As the sun started to arc up over the horizon, soldiers and Marines came out to observe the devastation that had been wrought by the actions overnight. Henderson Field was unusable. Almost all of the avgas had been destroyed. Critically, there'd been significant aircraft casualties overnight. Only 7 of the 39 SBD Dauntless bombers survived the night, and none of the TBF Avengers. However, at Fighter 1, 24 of the 42 Wildcats were still flyable, as were 4 of the P400s and 2 P39s. The US had over 20,000 personnel in the area, and despite 632 tonnes high explosive and steel being lobbed onto the area, just those 2,200 square metres, only 41 deaths were reported. Despite all the damage that had been done, reconnaissance flights took off from Guadalcanal that morning. They spotted the Japanese supply convoy, 6 transports and 8 destroyers, and they were only 140 miles distance. Vandergriff radioed, "Urgently necessary this force receive maximum support of air and surface units," and he added, "Absolutely essential aviation gas to be flown here continuously." However, Guadalcanal would struggle to generate any air power against the convoy, given the bombardment. Scott's task force, after the Battle of Cape Esperance, was refuelling and wouldn't be available for 24 hours, and the only operational carrier that the US Navy had at this point, Hornet, well, she was refueling, and no match for the entire combined fleet. Replacement planes would come up from Espiritu Santo, but they would be useless if there was no avgas for them. Admiral Fitch organised for Army and Marine C-47 Douglas transports to freight drums of gasoline to Guadalcanal. Each aircraft could carry 10 55-gallon drums. One drum would be enough to keep a Wildcat in the air for 1 hour. So each aircraft was bringing 10 hours of flight time into Guadalcanal. The Japanese sent 2 bombing raids on the 14th to Guadalcanal. At this point, I think it's important to reflect that as we look back on the Guadalcanal campaign, we look on it as a great American victory. We see it as potentially a strategic turning point in the Pacific campaign. We see the culmination of the Japanese in World War II at Guadalcanal. But I've got to tell you, during the day of the 14th, the day after the bombardment, the soldiers, the Marines, the airmen, they certainly couldn't see that. During the afternoon, one of the staff officers from the Cactus Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Toby Munn, went to the 67th Fighter Squadron and he spoke to the pilots. "I want you to pass the word along that this situation is desperate. We don't know whether we'll be able to hold the field or not. There's a Japanese task force of destroyers, cruisers, and troop transports headed this way. We have enough gasoline left for one mission against them. Load your airplanes with bombs and go out with the dive bombers and hit them. After the gas is gone, we'll have to let the ground troops take over. Then your officers and men will attach themselves to some infantry outfit. Good luck and goodbye." Twice during his speech, those around him ducked because of Japanese shells. The Cactus Air Force was able to get 2 sorties airborne. However, they inflicted minimal damage on the convoy. General Miyazaki, the Chief of Staff of the 17th Army at Rabaul, upon hearing the news for the convoy, said, "The arrow has already left the bow." At midnight, the high-speed convoy reached Tassafaronga. The anchorage was protected by the destroyers, while 2 heavy cruisers, the Chikai and the Kinugasa, fired 752 8-inch shells into Henderson Field. Another night of bombardment, but nowhere near as bad as the bombardment. The morning of the 15th, as the soldiers and Marines awoke, if they looked to the west, they would see the masts on the horizon of the Japanese ships as they disgorged their cargo. The mouth of the Matanikaw River is just 13 kilometres from Tassafaronga Point. Air cover for the Japanese ships was provided by 2 aircraft carriers. The Cactus Air Force scavenged fuel from damaged aircraft. Some ad hoc attacks took off, but met with little success. Brigadier General Geiger, the commander of the Cactus Air Force, called for a halt as he looked to create enough force in a coordinated strike. This strike, together with a strike by B-17s from Espiritu Santo, was able to inflict some damage on the high-speed convoy. The convoy was withdrawn early from Tassafaronga. However, it had delivered all of the 4,500 men and 2/3 of the supplies that had been meant for Guadalcanal. This was a significant victory for the Japanese as they looked to reinforce the 17th Army. We'll leave the story there and we will continue on with the story of the Battle of Henderson Field next week.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.3war.org. theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.